Welcome to the latest episode of Silicon Bites, and prepare yourselves for a certain amount of ranting and raving as we examine why Trump has backed the wrong horse. Today, we'll dig into why Putin's strategy in Ukraine is failing, why pursuing the same delusional objectives using the same methods were always going to fail. We'll question why Trump has backed the wrong horse, decided to appease a loser, and what all this reveals about Putin's regime and its likely downfall. How its collapse will rebound negatively on Donald Trump and all those associated with him. And in case you're wondering, the horse with glasses in the video thumbnail is Lavrov. He is already so close to resembling a horse in appearance, it requires very few modifications to the image to make it look like him. And yes, Putin does have donkey ears in the very same image. Before we dive into that, thank you to everybody who supports the channel through Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. It's immensely important. Today, I want to do an extra special message. This is on behalf of a friend in Kyiv who works with the Ukrainian Armed Forces and the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. He's explained to me there is a serious shortage of blood plasma in Ukraine. He's had several messages from ex-comrades and medics asking if the Allies can help find much needed plasma for medical stations at various depots behind the zero or front line. This shortage is killing wounded fighters, men and women, and all too often, unfortunately, also the medics and ambulance drivers who try to evacuate them. A medic friend who's been saving lives in Ukraine for 3 years, he says, explained how she lost 4 medic friends and their units also sustained severe casualties because of the lack of medical evacuation units, ambulances, and plasma at the front. During recent delays in receiving equipment and supplies, one group had to walk out of the fire zone like World War I stretcher bearers, during which episode they suffered 50% casualties from enemy drones, including new solar-powered drone variants. We desperately need to find ways to improve casualty survival rates with basic supplies like plasma that we take for granted outside of Ukraine. I'm not collecting money directly, so please don't send anything to me. Write to the director of the organization. I'm going to put the link in the description of this video, especially if you have concrete solutions, connections to funds, or ideas on how this problem can be solved. Please don't waste his time if you only have vague ideas or simply want to share your thoughts and prayers. He needs real solutions now to save Ukrainian lives. Now let's jump back into the episode. Political analysts and historians who've been following Putin the longest and with the most objective gaze tend to conclude that Putin is an opportunist, not a strategist. This is what's led to the failure of the planning and execution of his invasion. It also has grave implications for Russia's future. In the next 15 to 20 minutes, we'll unpack Putin's miscalculations, why Ukraine keeps resisting, and the broader implications for his regime and global security, and why all of this ladders up to the conclusion that Trump has backed a loser. Multiple analysts argue Putin isn't the long-term chess player he portrays or wants us and his population to think of him as. He is not a three-dimensional chess player. Definitely not. A recent foreign policy piece bluntly frames him as lacking a coherent grand strategy, an opportunistic exploiter of Western missteps, weakness, and timidity, not a visionary leader. Multiple misreadings of historical fact haunt his calculations and actions. As The Conversation magazine warns, Donald Trump is making a serious error in appeasing Vladimir Putin because Putin sees Western leniency as a weakness to exploit. Meanwhile, Business Insider cites Poland's defense minister saying something similar. Putin mimicked Soviet-era economics and as a result has bankrupted Russia, trying to emulate the past. Mick Ryan's Substack really nails it, saying another big Putin mistake. overreach fueled by hubris, not geopolitical foresight. Put simply, Putin gambled that the West's hesitancy would paralyze Ukraine, but Ukraine's staunch defense of Kiev proved him wrong in 2022, and he's been making the same mistake over and over again. Let's look at a couple of specific instances, such as the Battle of the Antonov Airport in February 2022. Early in the war, Putin pinched an opportunity, likely defended airfields near Kiev, but his airborne assault collapsed. SAS-style missteps left troops vulnerable. The operation faltered and momentum evaporated. Where the SAS would have succeeded, Putin's forces, fortunately for Ukraine, failed miserably. It was a tragic comedy of Russian tactical failure, the failure to plan, to take the enemy seriously, or to have any contingency plans in case it went wrong. Hubris and contempt for his enemies, chiefly the Ukrainians, has perhaps been Putin's greatest strategic blunder, and he continues to repeat that mistake even 4 years into the full-scale war, and despite copious evidence of the resilience, innovation, competence, will, and bravery of Ukrainian forces. Ukraine defied expectations, their resilience, not by luck, but by unity strategy, and of course Western support paired with strong internal reforms. From Brookings Institute to Washington Post, experts highlight Ukraine's institutional resilience, cybersecurity strength, and battlefield innovation. Laura Thornton of the McCain Institute recently wrote, Ukraine is demonstrating military innovation and independence, but urgently needs continued US support. This was published in my journal, Courier.com. Well, that same idea pulses through every front, from cyber resilience to the frontline grit the Ukrainians are showing in the 1,000 kilometers of trenches that line the route of Russia's invasion. Well, Putin's opportunism has costs. Costs for Ukraine, of course, costs for Russia, and those costs ultimately may lead to complete failure. And the foundations of this opportunism are also built on mythologized and delusional history. On February 24th, 2022, Putin made a speech. Ukraine joining NATO is a direct threat to Russia's security. This is from archive.org and Wikipedia. He spun imperial narratives, venturing further back into history in his 2021 essay as well, declaring unity with Ukraine and rewriting their past. Putin again alluded to this in his most recent speech at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, declaring Russians and Ukrainians to be one people. The arc of his mistake is intact. He has not had the humility, wit, or courage to re-examine his fundamental mistakes that led to strategic errors. But his real motives were likely opportunistic, carve out spheres of influence to the west of Russia while tolerating instability on his border. The perception that instability amongst his enemies that border Russia is a strength for Russia reveals a deep flaw in his thinking, a foundational flaw in his logic, and a deeply primitive win-lose zero-sum game mentality that he brings to every strategic problem. Yet by demanding absolute terms of capitulation from Ukraine and demanding from his own army what they are not capable of, that is, swifter gains, deeper control, he has overplayed his hand over and over again. He overreached, as Owen Matthews concluded in his 2022 book on the invasion called Overreach, and he continues to overreach today. Even Igor Strelkov-Gerkin has commented on this in his latest ramblings from jail. Putin's summer offensive in 2025 is doomed to fail, he writes, because his ambition is too broad and the resource he has assigned to the task is too few. This is exactly the mistake of 2014 in the Donbass, or 2022 when he tried to take the whole of Kiev, and he continues to make that mistake today also. As The Guardian in May this year put it, he has punished Ukraine, and he won't stop there. He's playing a long, cynical game, but he does not have the resources, economic or military, to match his bloated ambitions. Meanwhile, America's role looms large. Brookings warns he's dangerous when the West misinterprets his moves. They are, of course, referring to Putin. Foreign policy says Putin insists that Russia will not step back from its goals, even when offered ceasefires, which, of course, Ukraine did via the Trump negotiation process. That comes from The Guardian. His greed for maximalist outcomes scuttled early openings for peace. And this misinterpretation of Putin has deadly consequences. The evidence is there, and it is proved repeatedly. After phone calls from Macron and Trump last week, Putin lashed out again against Kiev and its residents in a massive and brutal series of airstrikes. The pattern is now so clear that even Chancellor Merz of Germany said, when answering a journalist's question, "No, I will not speak to Putin because he always attacks and kills after speaking to a world leader." World leaders that try to see potential dialogue, even a diplomat in Putin, are badly misreading the situation. It may be better to imagine before yourself Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter, and you may start to get better at predicting his reactions to events, his motivations, and even thought processes. He is not a leader in the mold of Western leaders. He is not a diplomat. He sees the world very differently. Well, let's look at some of these responses. And again, this underscores why Trump has miscalculated and is backing a loser. Putin strikes back. Aggression always follows every engagement with Western partners. Putin repeatedly lashes out militarily every time a Western leader engages Ukraine diplomatically. It's a brutal pattern. The Kremlin weaponizes diplomacy to trigger escalation. Here are examples of this same diplomatic activity that has sparked previous attacks. The most recent is in July 2025, after the Trump-Putin call, and of course there was a huge missile barrage on Kiev just hours after that hour-long call between Trump and Putin took place. Russia launched its largest drone and missile assault yet on Kiev, deploying over 550 drones and ballistic missiles. That is quoted from The Guardian. Ukraine's Mikhailo Podolyak said it was a deliberate act of terror and a public humiliation of Trump. Proof of Moscow's intent to weaponize Western diplomacy. During the same call, Putin told Trump that Russia remains committed to its original goals in Ukraine. That, of course, is the erasure and emasculation of Ukraine. Within hours, Trump admitted he was very disappointed, saying, "I don't think he's looking to stop." The phrase "wake up and smell the coffee" seems apt. I'm not sure if Trump drinks coffee. He certainly doesn't drink alcohol. The next example is the Macron-Putin call, and that, of course, led to the same confrontation that we saw last week. Even routine outreach by world leaders seems to provoke some kind of response from Putin. After Macron's call, Macron pleaded for a ceasefire. Well, this routine always results in attacks by the Kremlin. Putin simply reiterates his threats relating to NATO. He reiterates his standard accusations and his perceived grievances. And then Russia increases its barrage of fire against Kiev. That was reported by apnews.com. We have to ask why this happens and why it's so important that Trump and others are not paying attention to Putin's almost guaranteed reactive aggression. So there's 3 points here. A, Russia's leadership sees Western engagement not as diplomacy, but as weakness, begging for exploitation. Putin told Macron that the West encouraged separatism. Everything is fine if it's against Russia, he said, warning the West keeps trying to bury Russia, but they'll soon die themselves. That was reported in Euromaidan Press. This sounds like paranoid rhetoric, delusional resentment. Should we take it seriously even? Well, yes, because Putin frequently makes these accusations, going back years, finding numerous ways to phrase the same ideas over and over again. His face scrunches up with loathing and venom as he spits out those words. I fear that he has truly internalized this demented and hateful rhetoric. An attack after any outreach to Russia sends a signal. You talk softly and you'll be met with violence. B. Domestic propaganda play. State media spins Western engagement as if it's aggression. This happens again over and over. Diplomatic outreach allows Putin to present himself as Russia's unwavering protector against foreign aggression, as they label it, while reinforcing his narratives in Moscow's tightly controlled information space. Or we could call it echo chamber. C. High-level bluffs. In August 2014, Barroso warned that Putin credits diplomacy with weakness. Putin reportedly responded, "If I want, I can take Kiev in 2 weeks." Well, of course, he didn't. He couldn't, and he hasn't. But that same threat echoes today. Diplomacy with Putin invites escalation, and it almost provokes a repetition of these same threats, these same maximalist threats against Ukraine and the West. That pattern of behavior is important because it hasn't changed from last week's Trump Putin call and a redeclaration of Putin's aims to the Macron call to the Barroso call in 2014. The pattern is there to read if people want to read and analyze it. Unfortunately, too few world leaders have been paying attention over the last 3 years. So here's a quick analysis of that aggression before we dive into the last segment of this episode. Putin's reflexive aggression reveals two truths. He frames diplomacy as weakness, and he uses it to fuel Russia's aggression. He uses military escalation as a tool of statecraft. This is not an accident. He is not playing by the same diplomatic playbook as Western countries. There are no coincidences. He weaponizes talks to shift the power narratives. When diplomacy arises, war inevitably follows. For him, diplomacy is just another form of psychological warfare. What do we do about this? Well, we must demand the recognition of Putin's behavior patterns and a response to it by Western politicians and diplomats. They must not fall into the same patterns of initiation and reaction. We must push Western capitals to note this pattern and only negotiate from a position of strength, not amid the peaks of violence being unleashed by Russia. Western allies must insist on calibrated, united responses. Every push for peace must be backed by consequences, explicit consequences, and then we must carry out those consequences if Putin does not comply. Putin's aggression cannot be allowed to be free floating and unchallenged. The delusion that we can bring Putin to the table by pulling our punches is seriously misguided and is a foundational error that leads to the mistakes that the Trump administration is making right now. It's through this content like this episode, and trying to educate our politicians and representatives that we can expose the cycle of Putin's pathological reactions. We must share analyses identifying this pattern to undercut the Kremlin strategy. So, what are the implications for Putin's regime itself? Well, Putin's failures have deeper fallout from economic shock to geopolitical isolation. The Financial Times recent article entitled Perfect Storm details how Russia's strategy to integrate with the West backfired. Sanctions remain poorly enforced, yet Russia evades even these via shadow fleet and via shadow partnerships with China and Iran. Opportunism becomes regime fragility. This is mirrored in the bandit capitalism that powers the Russian vertical of power. It does not generate wealth, rather, it burns wealth up and leads to a stifling of innovation. Putinism is built on corruption, cronyism, nepotism, conformity, and the loyalty of the Siloviki, the strong man classes, not any kind of institutional strength. That quote is taken from Wikipedia. Opposition is crushed, dissent is silenced. There is no succession process, and the future appears murky. The publication called The Week outlines a fragile inner circle post Putin that may be a little better, a little worse than Putin, but are hardly likely to transform the system or even have a desire to do so. The idea that what follows Putin will be far, far worse seems at this point implausible. It's much more likely that what follows Putin will be more of the same. This is the kind of regime and its successors that Trump has aligned with. These are the people he ultimately wants to normalize relations and trade with: kleptocrats, thieves, murderers, and psychopaths. Let's conclude. Here's the morale of the whole episode. In conclusion, Ukraine is defending Europe's order against more than just Putin's aggressive opportunism. It's also shielding Europe from a shadowy march into authoritarian aggression and a civilizational decline powered by a parasitic, kleptocratic mindset. Again, this is the country, this is the leader, and these are the values, those are the Russian world that Trump has decided to align with, to protect, to shield from sanctions, and in large part to enable. But we can't normalize his actions through false equivalency. Mearsheimer says NATO triggered all of this conflict, yet reality shows that Putin's invasion is fueled by imperial dreams and greed, not any kind of defensive response. Trump claimed in April that Ukraine has no cards and should not have attacked Russia in the first place. Of course, Ukraine did not attack in the first place. This is an easily disprovable lie. This conflict is a litmus test for democracy against distrust, for the rules-based order versus revanchist authoritarianism. It demands sustained Western support, not halting arms once enough is enough. It requires Western support for internal institutional reforms to insulate Ukraine's democracy, its transparency, its cyber resilience, its civic education from the assault by an authoritarian neighbor. We must also make sure that the West does not adopt the outdated and corrupt practices of the Russian world, which it is trying to actively export to our societies. We must push policymakers to hold Putin and his oligarchs accountable. Sanctions, media exposure, legal proceedings, etc. We must push on every front and not give oligarchs in our own countries impunity or immunity from the law and taxation. That is a backdoor for authoritarians like Putin to influence our societies and corrupt our institutions. Putin gambled on a weak West and a fractured Ukraine, and he lost. He continues to lose for the same reasons and based on the same flawed logic that led him to start the war. But the fight isn't just in the trenches, it's in capitals, in court buildings, and in the global consciousness, not turning away from the horrors being inflicted on Ukraine and not siding with the aggressor. Well, please share this episode with friends, family, and your political representatives, especially that call at the head of the episode to help Ukrainian medics to safely evacuate and treat the wounded at the front. Write to your leaders, stand with Ukraine, not as a charity case or as a victim, but as a country on the front line of freedom, not invincible and limitless in its resources, but as a partner that is shouldering the kinetic burden alone, bleeding to protect our freedoms. Because in Ukraine, Europe, and beyond, the struggle for democracy versus dictatorship is unfolding in our time, and freedom is on the line.